to make a plan to vote. Election day is next Tuesday. And it's really, really important. If you've already got a plan to vote, or if you please contact a person that you know and make sure they have a plan to vote. And if you're not in the US and you have US colleagues, get in touch with them and make sure they have a plan to vote, because it's super important. So with that said, we have 3 great thought-provoking talks in this session about the intersection of neuroscience and society. And I'm really looking forward to hearing them. As a reminder, we have the chat where you can post messages and clarification questions. Just make sure that you have the messages set to panelists and attendees so that way we can all see. If you'd like to introduce yourself now, you can use the chat to do that. So just introduce yourself if you're there. Also, we have a Q&A tab for questions. You can post at any time and upvote your favorites. For those of you on Twitter, you can tweet about this session. And if you do, use the hashtag NMC3. So I'll get started here by introducing our first speaker. That is Katie O'Neill. She's a master's student working with Matthew Apps at the University of Oxford. And she's going to be giving a talk titled Science Fiction and Folk Knowledge in the Brain, Insights for Science Communicators.
Cool. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Adam. So to kick this discussion off, I'm going to start with a brief discussion of the general goals of neuroscience communication for non-expert audiences. So we have a couple different reasons we might want to communicate scientific findings in general. Could be to correct misconceptions, both in science, so that persistent myth that we only use 10% of our brains, might want to get rid of that one. Also in the process of science, how it's done. So the misconception that scientists are all old white men who exclusively wear lab coats and have very big frizzy hair. That's a misconception I'd like to get rid of, though I am working on my own frizzy hair. It'll be there soon. We also want to encourage participation in the scientific process, be this through participant recruitment, encouraging students to study neuroscience and psychology. We also want to encourage people to think critically about neuroscience justifications for policies and product design in the world, something along the lines of EEG attention tracking headsets in elementary schools to make sure that kids are always focused on their work. And one of the reasons I'm particularly interested in science communication is to provide additional context for questions that people have about the mind and brain. These questions could be personal, so whether memory training works, whether if they have a genetic predisposition to Alzheimer's, they should start memorizing decks of cards. These could be professional questions. So, oh, I've read that interviews introduce bias. Should I use brain scans to recruit the smartest employees? And I'm just going to come out and say, no, you should not do that. These could also be sociopolitical questions. So if people, especially in the contemporary American political landscape, have been hearing more and more about prison abolition, but are worried about what might happen with psychopaths, understanding the contemporary scientific knowledge of what psychopathy is and how it operates would be particularly useful. And in order to answer these questions and promote these goals, we need to understand how people come to understand the brain. And understandings of the brain come from a lot of different places. Some come from science classes. I don't know about the rest of you, but in elementary through high school science classes basically just told me that the brain does stuff. People learn a lot about what brains do by having a brain, noticing the things that it does, talking to others. I know that sounds like somewhat of an obvious one. Apologies for my bed back there. This is the world of Zoom. But talking to others, there have been a lot of conversations on Twitter recently about people discovering that they have aphantasia, which is the inability to produce mental imagery, by realizing that others actually could imagine an apple or a beach or something in their head. And this is true for a lot of non-neurotypical communities, especially on the internet. And then a third major way that we learn about the mind and the brain is through media representations. And this is where science fiction comes in, particularly stories about artificial intelligence, aliens, advanced animals, minds that are like ours, but are different in some fundamental way. So let's talk about what kind of conceptions of the mind and brain that science fiction books and movies promote. So since this is a talk that involves science fiction, I'm contractually obliged to talk about Frankenstein. as it is considered the first novel that could be labeled science fiction. I'm also going to note that there are previous science fiction novels before this. If we want to take a look at Francis Bacon's New Atlantis in the utopian tradition, Margaret Cavendish's Description of a New World, got some lovely Hollow Earth stuff from the 1600s and 1700s. But let's talk about Frankenstein. And I'm actually not going to talk about the creature first. First, I'm going to talk about in the very beginning, where we have Robert Walton discovering Victor Frankenstein, the scientist's frozen body, where he is thawed out and prepares to tell his story. And the central conceit here, with the idea of cryogenics, the ability to freeze and thaw people, that is related to the way the creature is created, is that there's some animating force that can bring a brain from a hibernating state to a live state. That frozen brains can be restarted as long as the starting position is maintained. And this promotes the idea that the brain is, on a certain scale, a finite state machine, that there are limited deterministic biological processes of the brain that are inherently pausable and restartable as long as some central state is maintained. And today, we would see that as an implication that the brain shares fundamental properties with a computer. However, if we look at Frankenstein in historical context, it came out 20 years before Charles Babbage's original mechanical computer, many years further before Ada Lovelace's famous first computer program. So what you see in the time surrounding the publication of Frankenstein is descriptions of the mind and body represented in terms of some sort of contemporary technology with wide popular recognition. So you can see Charlotte Bronte in Shirley, with her narrator talking about herself as a human mill with a heart that is a boiler. And you don't see comparisons to technologies that share the same mathematical underpinnings of this finite state machine. So you don't see the brain described as a train semaphore. You don't see the brain described as a turnstile. But as the computer has gained cultural primacy, and the von Neumann computer specifically has gained cultural primacy, its metaphorical tendrils have had a greater impact on the ways we think about the brain. So the metaphors of the von Neumann computer have affected our conceptualizations of the brain in three main ways: our understandings of how the brain works, what the brain is for, and how we as ourselves relate to the brain. So with relation to how the brain works, the von Neumann computer promotes an idea of modularity. Don't worry, we're not going to get super into photo here, but we see things that promote an idea that separate individual parts of the brain do individual things, are replaceable by each other. So we see things like in the Minority Report, which is originally a book and also a movie, we see something where someone's eyeballs are removed and replaced. A part of the central nervous system, admittedly an outside one, that is easily replaceable. We also see a form of modularity with the brain in response to, or in relation to, the body. So we see this in examples like brain uploading to computers, brain replacements, brain transplants. So in movies like The Matrix, Avatar, Captain America, Winter Soldier. And the important thing here is that the brain is considered independent from the body. And what's particularly interesting about this to me is that this metaphor has become more and more popular as our ideas of work and self have become further abstracted from the physical world. So most people can understand and explain to you how a hammer works technologically. By the time you get to a bicycle or a toilet, most people struggle. And when you get to neural nets, these are very hard to explain in terms of physical phenomena, which means it's easy to separate the functions of the mind, the functions of cognition, from the embodiment in a human physical body. One of the other things that this metaphorical framework has told us about how the brain works is that language is a computer program. So you get a lot of classic science fiction works steeped in the tradition of Sapir-Whorf, of linguistic relativity and linguistic determinism. You get Samuel Delaney's Babel 17 and Languages of Pow, both of which have language as a force in war, as a way of changing people's way of thinking to bring them towards a certain ideological position. Of course, you have Snow Crash, which introduces ancient Sumerian as the operating system of the human brainstem. You have books like 1984 and Sophia Ray's lovely short story collection, Everything is Made of Letters, that talk about how language degradation can be used as a tool of authoritarianism by making people think differently, thinking in line with the state. One of the other ways this metaphor is constructed is in understanding the brain as readable, writable, and erasable. And it's worth noting that this isn't necessarily false. It's just overextended, as metaphors often are. So with definitions of brain reading, we can take a look at fMRI, EEG, dream and visual stream decoding. Like, there are definitely ways we can tell generally what's happening in the mind, but it's certainly not as pronounced as it would be as going into a computer address and retrieving a piece of memory. Because humans use generally content addressable memory rather than address addressable memory, like computers do, it's a different retrieval process. With writing, there's actually a talk, I think tomorrow or the next day, about sculpting visual concepts in the mind that I'm very interested to see, related to this idea that writing information into the brain, as would be true for a computer, is possible. There's also a long tradition of erasing memories in science fiction. My favorite example is Men in Black, being able to flash a bright light and having very specific sets of memory erased from people's minds. While certain forms of memory erasure, like blocking certain PKM molecules in snails, is possible, it's definitely limited to a recent range of memory. It's definitely not as specific as science fiction teaches us that it can be, in line with this computational metaphor. So in terms of thinking what the brain is for, this is a big one for taking a look at stories that center on artificial intelligence. So we often see AI as calculators and administrators. Again, in Minority Report, these artificially all-knowing minds can predict crime before they happen. In the Fantastic Four movie, an absolute classic from 2007, Mr. Fantastic promotes the Superhero Registration Act because he's perfected the art of Asimovian psychohistory and is able to predict that billions of people will die unless this happens. We also view artificial intelligence as an existential threat, which tells us something about the way we conceptualize the mind as a device for dividing self and other and protecting self over other. That's fodder for a whole nother talk, so I won't get into that today. One of the other things this computational metaphor tells us is the way we should relate to our brains. So one of the things we learn from Asimovian psychohistory, from the Foundation novels, is that brains are individually unpredictable, but predictable in large numbers. We also learn that brains are something that we have and use rather than something that we are. So if we take a look at Lucy, which is one of the big promoters of this 10% metaphor, if we can just unlock the rest of our brain, it will allow us to be all that we are. However, on the flip side, we also get messages steeped in biological determinism, like in The Fifth Element, where characters recreated from a scrap of DNA, fully aware of her culture, able to speak a language, ready to go. We also have the idea that—
you have one.
Yes.
I just want to let you know you have 1 minute.
Okay, cool. We also have the idea that brains control our behavior, implies a causal direction. We can talk about that more in questions. How should this guide our science communication methods? It introduces specific places to check where your audience's assumptions about the brain and the language we use to describe it intersect. Woo, done. There we go.
Great. So I will give you one quick question and then we'll move on. So the question is, I am wondering how you think science fiction can be made more accessible to more people. While I agree that it's a good way to learn about the brain and technology in general, it seems like it's too niche to attract people who would benefit from learning these concepts. And you can give a short answer on screen, and if you want to do a longer answer, you can post in the chat.
My short answer is changing the trope that science fiction is only understood by the same nerdy old men we think are scientists, because that's absolutely not true. I can talk more about that in the comments, though.
It's a great answer. Great. So now we'll move on. That was awesome. Thank you so much for that talk. Our second speaker is Alexei Guzzi.